Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. That time of week again, everybody's favorite segment, the power rankings. Now, August is completely in the books. We are now entering the final month of the MLB season, and it's getting a little crazy. Of course, the power rankings, the top row has been one of the most unpredictable, changing all season long. It's been a lot of fun. The second row are the teams that are in the playoffs, trying to really hold on. In the third row, and really the teams that are pretty much trying to get into that last wild card spot now. With bottom two rows on this board now pretty much eliminated mathematically. Of course, they are not. I'm going to talk about that with a couple of teams. But before we dive in, guys, we added over 50 subs last week. Was by far the most watched video on this channel. So I just want to say thank you to everyone that tuned in. Smash that like button. We hit 200 likes, which again, channel record. This channel has been growing. I love the community. We are building. The whole idea of this channel is to bring guys and girls, of course, from all walks of life and all parts of the MLB, getting to hear from you guys from each team, because, of course, I can't go super in-depth with all teams all the time, so I love hearing from you guys, especially in the comments, just keeping the discussion going, and that's what this channel is all about. So if you guys are new, subscribe to the channel. We are giving away a new hat once we hit 1,500, and at this rate, that's going to be in a couple of weeks. Next week's power rankings is going to be a special one if I can get it off the ground. Expecting our first daughter, our first child this week, and depending on how that goes, might be missing the power rankings. I'm hoping not to, of course, for you guys. I try to do this every single week. Otherwise, I am going to try and do an NFL prediction video for the season that will come out probably midweek. So if you guys are into NFL, that's what we kind of switch over to once the MLB season is concluding. Otherwise, guys, we're going to jump into it. All 30 teams, starting with the bottom. Do I even really need to say this anymore? They are setting a new low again on a 10-game losing streak right now. 0-3 against Texas, 0-3 against the Mets. They are on pace for possibly the absolute worst winning percentage in the past 125 years. They call the modern era since 1901. And that they played less games back then, I guess you could say. But right now, if they finished the season with their win percentage that they have now, they would be the absolute worst team in 125 years. Just goes to show how bad of a season this has been for the White Sox. On top of that, the rest of the league, we only have one team above 600. Maybe that works for them. Maybe that works against them. I am not sure, but they are the worst. Number 29, sticking them in the bottom row again. They didn't really give me anything this week to decide to move them up. Everyone on the bottom row usually picks up a couple of wins. Cough, cough, unless you're the White Sox. They did win a series against the Seattle Mariners, so there is that going for them this week. They lost the first series against Detroit, but the Angels, not a whole lot going for them. We're seeing them test out a lot of their young arms, a lot of their young players getting an opportunity, and that's going to be a pretty big theme going forward with the rest of these teams. Number 28, they had an opportunity earlier this week to really try to break out, and I actually thought they won the series against Miami, but when I'm doing my studying, getting things ready, I realized they actually lost that series. They must have really blown that third game earlier in the week, so they lose that series 2-1. They lose to Baltimore over the weekend, so another 300 week for them, losing both series. The Rockies, of course, have the struggle of being a National League West team, and that kind of goes with Miami, number 27. So we're looking at all teams here, bottom of their division. Don't really think that they have too much else going for them this year. They're going to be testing out their roster. They're going to see who's going to be in the lineups next year, who they're going to invite back to spring training. In Miami, of course, a big part of that. We saw them have a pretty interesting weekend, though. They really laid the hammer down on the Giants, winning 2 games out of 1. We saw some big offensive numbers out of them, winning both series, actually, Colorado and the Giants. So a little bit of winning for Miami. We haven't seen a whole lot of that on a consistent basis, but the one thing we have seen is their offense seems to be somewhat getting better as the season goes on, maybe making room for that. And we see that with a couple other teams we're going to talk about in a second. Number 26, kind of burning through this bottom row because there's not a whole lot going for it right now. 2-1 against the Yankees. So nice little start to the week. Washington has shown all season long that they have been competitive, especially against teams on top of the board. no team should really be taking them lightly, but then they go up against the red hot Cubs, and the Cubs walk in there and sweep them away. Kind of one of those situations where if you're going to want to start being in that playoff conversation, you're going to have to beat Washington, and that's what they did. Washington, of course, is almost 10 games, I think, ahead of Miami, so there's a pretty thick line here in terms of win percentage, at least. Maybe when they start playing each other now, I think most of these teams would match up well, Miami and Washington especially, but maybe Washington would still beat up on these bottom two. Number 25, welcome back to the bottom row. I do have the Pittsburgh Pirates. They have been a staple in this bottom row. Not this season. This season, we thought they finally would break out, but it's almost like it happened again. Every season for the past, I think, 3 years, they've started bottom the year before. They start working their way up. They have a great April. They're middle of the pack, and then they just, by September again, they're back in the bottom row, and that just seems to be Pittsburgh's story. 0-3 against the Cubs. 1-2 against Cleveland. I don't know off the top of my head, but I feel like they've only won 10 games over their past 40. That's what it feels like writing about Pittsburgh. And as a Pittsburgh fan, you want to hope that some of these players they've been drafting, some of these guys, that they just all come together. It's just not seeming to work out. Paul Skeens is, of course, the highlight of this roster right now, and a lot of attention being spent on him. But you want to see some of these position players break out, and it just hasn't happened. In a division that I thought was quite up for grabs for a team like Pittsburgh, it's kind of falling apart. And unfortunately, the rest of this division does tend to follow suit. Number 24, I had to break them out of the bottom row. Don't know how I feel about it. If they're going to continue to roster the team like they did today, they're going to go right back down. But that was somewhat interesting. They went 3-2 against Boston, having that interesting situation where Danny Jansen played for both teams in the same game when they're making up it. Then they split the rest of them. And then they play Minnesota this weekend, and they have the rubber match today. And for me, it's a little interesting because realistically, the Jays, if they went on a 15-game heater, which is not impossible in the MLB, maybe for the Jays, but with the starting rotation that they have, I figured it wasn't impossible. They send out all of their scrubs, essentially, Vladdy, Kirk, Varsho, Springer, all getting the day off today, and in a pretty much a must-win situation if you're thinking you're in a playoff race, and realistically 8 games out of the wild card, not impossible. So it was a little surprising to see as a Jays fan, but I guess they're just giving up completely. I guess having a hot 5 teams probably helps. Number 23, if you watched my video a few weeks ago now, I think it was 3 weeks ago, I predicted Cincinnati to somehow make it into the playoffs. And ever since that, they have just fallen off a cliff. 1-2 against Oakland, 1-3 against their division rival, the Milwaukee Brewers. And I think they've only won about 6 games since I made that video, maybe more, but it's just been wheels falling off the wagon. Cincinnati is in this division. They've now slowly fallen back down. Quite a few games behind the Cardinals. Quite a few games as well now behind the Cubs after this week. And Cincinnati kind of falling apart, and I don't think they're really going to be able to find their heat again. We saw the heat at the beginning of August, late of July. I thought they were going to really build off that and continue that forward. I didn't think their schedule was too tough as long as they continued to win in their division, and they just didn't, and that was pretty much prime and front row center this week. Number 22, I do have the Oakland A's. They're slowly but surely chipping up on this board. I think they sat number 26 for a month and a half at one point straight. They were like basically solid, the 5th worst team in my power rankings. But ever since then, they've been pretty steady, at least, very least, 500 ball club. 2-1 against Cincinnati, 1-2 against Texas this week. I was kind of interested to see how they would match up against Texas. I was wondering if they would be able to take the reins from them, but just wasn't meant to be, falling short in the series this weekend. But Oakland's got to be a little excited. They've had some pretty young guys, and they're having some guys have a possibility to build off of. But again, it's the Oakland A's. It kind of feels similar to what the Pittsburgh Pirates are. Are we starting to get a little excited? And then next season, it's just going to be the same old story. We all know that they are going to be moving right out of Oakland. Their last game coming up there, of course, this month. Be interesting to see, can they close out the season being a relatively strong team, playing 500 baseball, working their way up to the top of the second bottom row? Very possible. We have seen them in the playoffs, top 2 on this board before, unlike Pittsburgh, which is exciting. Number 21, We just talked about how they beat Oakland, and I think these two teams on paper right now, and especially how the season has gone, they're really close. In the standings, I think they have quite a few games separating them. That's why I wanted to see them play this week. I did think Oakland had a chance, but at the same time, Texas had a pretty solid week. One of the best weeks they've had in a long time, 5-1 on the week. But they played two teams that were below them, Oakland and, of course, the White Sox, who have lost 10 in a row and are possibly the worst team in MLB history. So to be able to build off that, I didn't really move Texas. I think they only ended up hopping Cincinnati at this point because the teams ahead of them, I think, still will beat them more times than not. Number 20, Tampa Bay Rays. At a point in time, about a month ago, they were sitting a little bit over 500. And they were beating teams in the top two rows pretty consistently, at least taking them the fight to them almost all the time. And I always talked about how their roster, they traded all their guys. The next rotation man always seemed to come up, but it's starting to catch up with them. Like the depth isn't going to be there if you always trade away your guys. 1-2 against San Diego this week, as well as going 1-2 against Seattle. So a losing week against two teams that are ahead of them. Seattle, of course, one of those teams that is barely ahead of them, actually. We'll talk about them right now. Seattle, number 19, lowest they've been on the board in quite some time. I think the series win against Tampa Bay is probably one of the first, at least feels like. I think they beat San Francisco actually the series before that too. So it was probably back-to-back series wins there. But Seattle has been trying to stop the bleeding because ever since they were on top, they had that 10-game lead in the division. And it's just been slowly but surely bleeding out at all. The thing that hurts me the most and why I dropped them even lower on this board, even though they had a 500 week beating Tampa Bay, they lose to the Angels in a series, and a team like Seattle, who is in that playoff race, who's trying everything desperately not to fall out of the race and stay in it, losing to the Angels is not the way to do it. Teams that are going to be going into the playoffs or are fighting for their lives in the wild card race need to be doing better than losing 2 games to the Angels. And that just really hurt them, in my opinion. And overall, coupling that in with the past 6 weeks with how bad it's kind of been for Seattle, the rest of this middling row that we're about to talk about has at least had more consistent performances, sticking around 500 or coming up from this row and working their way up and having winning records. Seattle seems to be that team going in the other direction. Number 18, I have those San Francisco Giants. Even though Seattle did beat them less than 10 days ago, I did put them up a little bit more. Even though 1-2 against Milwaukee, 1-2 against Miami, arguably could be here too. I think the fact that San Fran is still above 500 and has had other times where they look a little better and a little more consistent than Seattle, decided to go that way. Other than that, like San Fran, this is kind of where we're starting to look at teams that aren't in the playoffs. Of course, I've talked about it even as far down as here. You start winning 10, 15 in a row, of course, you're going to be back in the conversation. But that's the kind of runway you need now. You need to have a massive win streak. You're starting to see how many different teams you have to hop over. Because you got to remember, 12 teams make the playoffs. Of the top 12, you might have 7 on the one side and 5 on the other. So maybe you're looking at top 14 to really be in the conversation. And if you're down here, that's almost 10 teams you have to hop. Number 17, one of the hottest teams in the MLB right now. And I had to sport my new Tigers hat to give them a little bit of credit. 2-1 against the Angels. 2-1 against the Boston Red Sox. Kind of what I was saying about Seattle. Detroit at least did it. Wasn't a sweep, but you beat them 2-1, and that's what you need to do. You need to beat these teams in the bottom row. I'm not going to always expect sweeps. Of course, that's your best opportunity if you're going to be in this playoff race. But to do that is absolutely epic. And then to play a team that was at one point in this second row for a long, long time, is the number 1 team ahead of you in the wild card race. To win that series is massive. Of course, I didn't move them past Boston because I still think in a best of 5, maybe Boston has their number right now. But if it keeps going this way, Boston has been trending down. Detroit, of course, trending up, but Detroit was sitting in this bottom row for quite some time. They've really had to chip their way back up, and they are doing that. So if they keep this up, they're going to start flying up. Number 16, I think the hottest team right now in the MLB. What was it? 6 games in a row now that they have won. And out of their past 8 games, they have 4 games where they've scored at least 14 runs, which is absolutely impressive. Shout out to Con, who put that in our Discord, that stat. Love hearing from you guys those kind of stats that I can talk about in this video. But the Cubs, they're hot. They're one of the hottest in the MLB. Didn't move them up too much because if we really take it at its word, we look at their schedule, it's a lot of teams in the bottom half. So you should be winning those. But they've been one of the most spread teams on this power rankings all season long. As high as 6, I think as low as 26 a couple of months ago. They've slowly been coming back up. Their offense has been on fire. It's an interesting week coming up for them because they do have the Yankees and Dodgers coming up over the next 10 days. And before that, they do have the Pittsburgh Pirates, who they did sweep this week. It's going to come down to how they play in their division. They have a few games against the Reds, of course, the Pirates, and they have the Cardinals right ahead of them. But if you remember this season so far for the Cubs, playing within their division has been one of the downsides to this team. I think when we were looking back, I did a video when they were falling down the power rankings. I forget exactly what it was, but it was something along the lines they'd lost like 6 or 7 in a row against their own division, 6 or 7 series, not just games, series in a row against their own division. But now you have a chance to redeem yourself. You're in the wild card hunt. You're still a few games out. You got to build off it, and you got to win these series coming up against the Yankees and Dodgers. That's going to be key going forward. Number 15. I do have the Cardinals, even though the Cubs in standing wise are ahead of the Cardinals. Cardinals were ahead of them going into this week. Cardinals had a pretty good week. They played 2 top line teams. They beat the Yankees 2-1. Really showed a big side of offense that we hadn't seen from the Cardinals all season long. Like, the offense was really popping this week. 2-2 against the Padres, again, one of the hottest teams over the past month. So a really good week for the Cardinals. They were one of my trending up teams last week, so for them to build off that into a winning week against 2 of the top tier teams, I have to give them the edge right now. And right now, if I saw the Cardinals play the Cubs, I'd be betting on the Cardinals. Number 14, we have the Boston Red Sox, and Boston is kind of hanging on to this spot. They were in this spot, I think the exact same spot last week. Didn't necessarily feel like dropping them all the way down here because I still think they are quite powerful. They've had a couple of pretty rough weeks, and I'm not going to hold this 1 week against them. Losing to the Jays. The Jays, I think, are a little bit better than a 2014 on paper. They just haven't shown it at all this season, so for them to lose that series, not something I'm too worried about. And then Detroit, another team, a hot team. When a cold team meets a hot team, I kind of expect a 2-1 kind of series to happen. So not a huge surprise there. I think given if both these teams are playing at their best performance, I still think Boston is capable. Boston does have a lot of their own fate in their hands. They have a lot more games against the Jays. If the Jays keep rostering like they did today, I expect them to do better. They have a lot more games against Tampa, a team that's starting to come back down to earth. So they're going to pick up some wins, and I think overall in the standings, they're going to be a little bit better than where they have been as of late. Are they going to be strong enough to get into the playoff race? I don't know, because right now I have them at number 14, and if you read into that, that means no. And they have a few teams to hop that we're about to just get into. It's going to be a little bit of American League rapid fire coming on up. Next up, we have the Minnesota Twins. If it wasn't for today, if they didn't win the series, I think I would have dropped them even more. There's something going on with the Twins. It's been a very streaky year. It just seems like so many different streaks happening. And right now, they're coming out of the tail end possibly of that losing streak. I didn't look ahead to see who they were playing next week. That's going to be pretty important. They started the week off, though, losing 0-3 to Atlanta. So that was a big blow to me in the playoff opportunities. I think they're chasing the Royals, they're chasing the Guardians, and I think they might even be ahead of the Royals technically in the standings. But I think on paper, and based on what I've been seeing, I think the Twins are chasing those guys for the playoff spot. I think when we're looking at this board, I think number 13, technically, they're the top 6 in the American League. I'll have to get back to that, but I'm pretty sure they are because I'm pretty sure I have 7 National League teams in the top 12. Number 12, I have those said Kansas City Royals, and I'm just going to put this team up at the same time because they kind of are intertwined in what's going on here. And before people start jumping down my throat, I know Kansas City won the series that these guys played 3-1 earlier in the week. But following that up, Kansas City, sure, you step up, you have a massive series against the Guardians, the team you're chasing for standings, and you got a real opportunity to put them away for a series sweep. You don't sweep them, so you go 3-1, and then you lose the next 4 in a row against another playoff caliber team. To me, that speaks that you're just not quite ready for the prime time fighting that's going to be come playoff time, etc. So that put a lot of damage in there. They've now lost 5 in a row. So as much as I had them ahead of Cleveland, dropping the next 5 in a row kind of made me think, okay, let's see a best of 7 these two teams. It's going to be super tight. These guys are interchangeable, but right now I'm giving the edge to Cleveland, especially when it comes to making the playoffs. Cleveland then answered back with a winning series, 2-1 against Pittsburgh. Like, nothing to write home about, nothing to really kick them up on the board. I think when we start getting the top 10 teams, I think there's a little bit of a line here of these teams being a little bit better. But I just want to highlight that these 4 teams really are in a thick playoff race. There's 2 wild card positions up. One of these is going to be a division leader, of course, and then there's going to be 2 other spots. Is it going to be Boston trying to get back into this? I think if the Twins don't find their way out of what's going on, it's very possible. Is Detroit sniffing around, playing 8-2 baseball over the last little bit? Super exciting what's going on, but it's pretty crazy, honestly, what's going on in the wild card race. Now we're going to get into the top 10, and it's absolutely nuts because we got 7 teams now for National League because we haven't even touched on that yet. Number 10 technically isn't even sitting in a playoff spot as of yet, and I have the New York Mets. The Mets have slowly but surely over the past 2 months just been working their way up this board, and showing realistically they're quite a competitive team, especially when they're playing playoff caliber teams. They started the week off with a big win against the number 1 seed Arizona Diamondbacks. Over the past 3 weeks, they had been number 1 on the power rankings. Mets come in, hand them 2 losses. Then they go in and they play the White Sox, a team where you got to win the series. Not only did they win, they followed it up with a sweep. So a 5-1 week. There's still a couple of games back in the wild card race, but realistically, if it wasn't for interleague play and divisions and whatever, I think the Mets are a top 10 team, and they might just purely miss out because the National League at this point is just that much better. Number 9, I do have the Atlanta Braves holding on to that last spot in that National League wild card right now, 3-0 against Minnesota. So that's played a little bit into the why Minnesota's dropped, why I've kind of created the American League Central to be a little bit farther back than right now the National League East, who had a little bit of a power that shift in the dynamic right now. And Atlanta continues to find wins even with the injuries piling up all season long. So Atlanta showing that they're capable. A couple of games up on the Mets, but unfortunately it seems like one of these teams are destined to miss the playoffs, and at this rate it's going to be the Mets, but it could go either way. I'm interested what you guys might think on that. Number 8, I do have the Baltimore Orioles, and I feel like I'm saying this every single week. The Baltimore Orioles continue to just play 500 baseball, and there's not much else to say on other than that. If it wasn't for the beginning of the season, they would have not been where they are right now. They'd be probably a little bit more worried about whether they're going to make the playoffs. I don't really think that's going to be a problem. As long as they play 500 baseball, I think they'll be all right. And lucky for them, the rest of their division has kind of got beaten down. Here, the offense has been somewhat solid as of late. They went 1-2 against the Dodgers, followed it up with a 2-1 series win against Colorado. Both of these on a road trip. So 500 on a road trip, gotta be pretty excited, especially going out west. They won the first game against the Dodgers. Couldn't close for a second, but that would have been pretty massive for them. I have not too much worried. Zach Eflin, continues to be pretty monster additions for the Baltimore Orioles. So the starting pitching has done a little bit better than I would have thought, and it's been kind of more consistent considering the injuries they've dealt with. But Baltimore continues to kind of keep it close, and at the very same time, they haven't moved up the board, but the team they are chasing, who has been like top 3, top 5 for a number of weeks, has fallen down to the second row now. And that's just how close I have it. I think it's a 1.5 game separating the two of them, right? Now, I'm not so sure. For the longest time, I kept saying the Yankees are going to win it. They're just going to find their way. They're going to win it. And it just does not seem to be happening. And this week was a prime example of maybe I'm wrong. 1-2 against St. Louis, again, one of the hotter teams, but then 1-2 against Washington over the weekend. Not exactly something to be excited about. If anything, the Yankees should be a little bit worried because if you're not winning this division, I think the Yankees are very much in jeopardy come playoff time because in a best of 3, I don't know how well the Yankees will match up comparatively to a best of 5. A lot of concern because they gave up a lot of runs this weekend. And sorry, I did say that they played Washington over the weekend, but I know it was St. Louis. Why did they give up so many runs to the Cardinals? I didn't really look deeply into the box score, but that's got to be somewhat of a concern as well. It's been a lot of inconsistency, definitely, when it comes to their starting pitchers. Number 6, and finally making their way back up into the top row. It's been a little bit of a struggle as of late, but we saw Philly kind of right the ship this week. 2-1 against Houston, a pretty awesome series against a team that has been pretty dominant, beating almost everyone on this board. And then Philly beats Atlanta, which I think was a chance Atlanta to get really back into this, really say, I'm more real than you might think. But Philly puts a stop to it. Philly pretty much all but secures the division win, I think, with that series here. So a little bit of excitement there. And I know the game's back. It's like, I know it can be overcome. It's not like insurmountable, but there's a little bit of momentum when it comes to baseball. I think Philly kind of has the momentum going in, which is super exciting. Number 5, I think for the 4th week in a row, we have the San Diego Padres playing slightly above 500. But right now, playing above 500 when you are where you are is probably enough to keep you where you are because we have teams here who are basically not playing 500 or are 500. And you have these central teams, other than the Mets, who have been playing sub 500, feels like, for the past few weeks. So being above 500 is going to put you in the top 5, especially if you've been showing that kind of consistency like the Padres have. 2-2 against St. Louis, 2-1 against Tampa. So winning a series against Tampa. A nice series split with the Cardinals. I would have loved to see more. Had they walked away with a 3-1, it might be considered for them higher. They won the first 2 in that series, so to fall the next 2 is a little concerning again. The depth might not be there in the pitching aspect for the Padres, but got to keep them at number 5 for now. Next up, I do have the Houston Astros. Now, before you say, but Alex, the Phillies beat the Astros. How are the Astros higher? When we look at a 2-game series like that and it goes 2-1, we can't put too much into it. Astros followed that series loss up. That does play into it a little bit. How does a team follow up a loss, a series loss? And they followed up with masterclass 4-0 sweep of the Kansas City Royals. On top of that, Houston must have like 10 plus more wins than the Phillies do over the past month and a half. So that's going to be a big part of it. And the Phillies have struggled for the most part against teams in this top row, especially, and teams above 500. So those 3 factors kind of play into it being more than that. Other than that, right now I do have the Astros clearly as the number 1 team in the American League. And it's starting to be a little bit bigger gap than you would have thought. We only really got 3 teams in the top 10, and 2 of them aren't even in the top row. So that just goes to show how I am feeling about this National League. And it's going to get super interesting because we're going to go to number 3 now, who couldn't do it. They couldn't go for a 4-peat this week. Kind of cemented some of the issues that I was worried about when it came to the Diamondbacks. Most specifically, that it felt like they were always having to come from behind, especially over the past few weeks. The bullpen has been somewhat inconsistent. We saw it pretty much against the Dodgers this weekend. They are playing their 4th game against the Dodgers tomorrow. So far, they are down 2-1, and it's been somewhat close. So they really smashed them today. Friday was, a 10-9 game or something like that, but bottom of the 9th, Arizona scored 4, so it really wasn't as close as it might look. And for Arizona to lose to the Mets, that's 2 series back-to-back now that they have lost. They have technically lost 3 of their last 5 series, so a little bit of concern going on there. Of course, none of them are sweeps, and they had a 6-game winning streak in between. So keep that in mind. Arizona, of course, still very dominant. We saw how dominant their offense was today specifically, but some of their glaring issues that I had kind of been worried about really veered its head over the past couple of weeks. So did knock them down to number 3. And that brings us to number 2. This team was it this week, I think, shout out to Tommy, who said that they are now holding the best run differential in the entire MLB. And I wouldn't have noticed that, honestly, if it wasn't for him. So thank you for that. But Milwaukee has been pretty consistent. The one big difference to me over them and over the Dbacks is the bullpen. The bullpen has been able to close games a lot more safely. Of course, every bullpen has its issues, but a lot more safely than the Dbacks. Milwaukee 2-1 against San Fran, 3-1 against Cincinnati. Not the greatest of teams, but they are closing their way into 600, which, as we know on this MLB season, is quite the feat. I don't really have much else to say against Milwaukee, but they've been pretty consistent. It feels like over the past 5-6 weeks, they're doing well. Next up and top of the board, I heard a lot of people talking about this maybe 2 weeks ago. Last week wasn't so much of a debate about who was top in the spot, but the Dodgers, I think, finally have really cemented their edge. A lot of it has to do with how they basically beat Arizona this weekend so far. Arizona comes back, makes it 2-2 tomorrow. Might make a difference, but I think the powerhouse Dodgers are pretty much there. And they had a nice comeback series win against Baltimore, which played a big part of it. Now everyone is watching to see if Ohtani hits 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases, very much on pace. Last I looked, he was 43. He might have added one of another since then. But there you guys have it. There's the 30 teams, talking about them all, the power rankings as of September 1st. And if you guys made it this far, please like, subscribe, and smash some comments in the bottom. I like to hear what you guys think. What is there a team that I'm not really on par with? Where am I missing some key information that I might want to use in future videos? I love hearing from you guys in the comments. That's really what makes me keep coming back and doing this, is the discussion and keeping it going. So guys, thanks for watching. We will see you out there for that next video.